I've made a lot of dumb watch mistakes so that you don't have to. Seriously though, shopping for watches, especially vintage watches, especially on a budget, is hard. You not only have to figure out what watch to buy, but also how to maintain it and how to ensure that the seller knows what they're doing. We've got a roundup of great watches to get you started on your hunt, and we've got a handful of important tips at the end of the video. You do not want to miss those. First up, the Tissot PRX is taking the watch world by storm, but did you know you can get the vintage version, the pre-PRX, for roughly the same price? It's the Tissot PR516, and it's got that slim and sexy profile that looks good on any wrist. The three-hander movement is easy to service, and you've got a few different styles available with integrated bracelet versions, strap-friendly versions, and divers too. Fun fact, it was also worn in the 1973 James Bond film Live and Let Die. But of course, if you like the modern PRX, it's a great watch, so just get that too. Seiko, as usual, is coming through with the best bang for your buck in both modern and vintage. To get started, you can just set a price range on Chrono24 and search to your heart's delight. There are way too many great models to cover in just this video, but here are three to get you started. The first thing you're going to want to look up is the Seiko World Time. The most popular reference here is the 6117. Get some fun pops of color here on top of the real-world functionality. Next is Seiko's mono-pusher chronograph made for the 1964 Olympics. I talked about this watch on this channel, but for good reason. This is Seiko's first chronograph movement, and you get a rotating bezel here as well. You've got your choice of the 5717 and the 5719, depending on which bezel style you want. Finally, it's the Seiko chronograph reference 6139, known as the Pode. That's because it was worn by astronaut Colonel William Pode in 1973 as part of the Skylab 4 mission. So if you want a piece of history at a good price, this is it. You'll get bonus points for choosing the signature orange dial. Just keep in mind my tip for buying chronographs at the end of the video. Also, if you like Seiko but aren't super sure about diving into the vintage market, the brand also has vintage-inspired reissues like the SRP K17, so you get the look and feel that you're after without the potential surprises of a vintage watch. This next watch should be more expensive than it is. Gerald Genta, the Michael Jordan of watch design, the guy who made the AP Royal Oak and the Patek Philippe Nautilus, also designed this watch as a young man. It's the Universal Geneve Polerouter, and it was designed for the SAS, the Scandinavian Airline System. They used it on a groundbreaking flight over the North Pole from Copenhagen to Los Angeles. The watch is a gem of mid-century design. You have these long, twisted lugs that suspend the case so perfectly. It often has a crosshair dial and a trapezoidal date window that seamlessly integrates into the dial design. Speaking of dials, the Polerouter is responsible for some of the best tropical dials on the market if you're into that. And for bonus points, see if you can find one with the original SAS caseback. I know many serious collectors with lots of knowledge and lots of buying power who proudly collect and wear these watches. So this is such a good buy on so many levels. I have a warning about gold-plated watches later in the video, but these are surprisingly easy to find in solid gold. Also, if you're into vintage chronographs, we could do a whole video on the arsenal of chronographs from Universal Geneve. For military watches, one of the best starting searches you can do is type in military into the search bar on Chrono24 and sort from low to high. Then you can dive deeper into your research on individual models that resonate with you. For American history, you can find great examples from Hamilton, Benris, and Marathon, including the Marathon GGW113. This was only made for 1 year and has a lot of cool history with it as well. For World War II history, there's no better place to look than the Dirty Dozen watches worn by the Allied forces. It's Omega time, and there are a lot of watches to mention here. Omega is like Seiko in the amount of value they offer, but in arguably a more prestigious package thanks to their Swiss watchmaking heritage. If you or someone you know has been asking for an affordable vintage watch from a good brand, this is what they mean. For a lot of enthusiasts, vintage Omega is where they start, and this is the only watch for a lot of people as well. If you maintain them well, they can essentially last forever. The main strong point for the brand, I'd say, is with their dress watches, or what we would today consider to be dress watches. The Seamaster should be your first stop, followed by the Ville and Geneve lineups. If you like the look of an integrated bracelet, the Constellation is also a strong option. And if you want something with a lot of vintage character, check out the Omegas with the 30T2 movement. These are gorgeous and date all the way back to the 1930s. Speaking of watches from good brands that will get you some respect around the office, you can get lucky with vintage Tudors. You can find simple three-hander dressy pieces in placid sizes that are built well and have that great brand heritage in tow. For bonus points, check out the rose dial Tudors. And for something specifically cool, check out the tuxedo dial worn by Roger Sterling on Mad Men. Now, before we get to the tips and tricks section of the video, I should also mention that you can even find Rolex watches for cheap if you're confident enough to wear a 34mm. Many overlook these, but they're the best deals out there for the crown. And some of the dial designs are very tasteful. Okay, it's time for some important things to keep in mind before diving into the sometimes murky waters of vintage watch collecting. Some are common sense, some are a little more niche, and some are just dumb little life lessons that I've learned the hard way. First and most importantly, do your research on the watch and the seller. Check to make sure the seller has good reviews and to make sure that the watch has its original crown, hands, and dial. Also set aside a budget for repairs and have a repair shop in mind just in case. These are aging machines and the movements will need a tune-up or replacement parts sooner or later. With that in mind, don't expect the accuracy of a modern watch. Vintage watches, vintage cars, and vintage bodies accumulate eccentricities over time, and they don't keep that fresh out of the factory level of performance forever. If that's a deal breaker for you, then easy, just stick to modern watches. Also, don't get it wet. You can have dive watches pressure tested if you want, but it's best to consider them to be retired from the line of duty. They've already had a full life, they do not need to be full of water. Common sense tip for you, simpler movements last longer and are easier to repair. In other words, if you don't want to take on a potential project, don't buy a vintage chronograph or other complicated watch. I've made this mistake a lot, buying jump hours and bumper movements. Basically, if it's a rare watch that wasn't that popular back then with some weird little functionality to it, it's gonna be really hard to fix today. Don't buy gold-plated watches. Don't do it. The more you wear them, the more the gold rubs off, and that's not a good look. On the subject of polishing, many or most vintage watches have been polished, but that's not a deal breaker. Just make sure it's not overly polished, like a smooth little pebble. The character of a watch is found in those sharp edges. Also make sure the lume on the hands matches the lume on the dial. You can look at other examples, even just via Google Images to start, to confirm that it has the correct components like dial, hands, crown, etc. Even if you don't buy the watch, this is a great way to learn. Let's talk quartz. If you think I'm going to tell you to steer away from these, then you're in for a surprise. I know if you're watching this, you're probably hunting for a mechanical watch, and it makes sense. A vintage mechanical watch is a beautiful thing, still ticking away after all these years. I mean, this is from the 40s. But including quartz in your search will greatly expand your options for affordable watches. Quartz was the key movement for the 1970s and much of the 1980s, and you'll find some really cool case shapes from this era featuring quartz movements. Plus, they're approachably priced, they're thin, they're accurate, and in terms of maintenance, they either work or they don't. It's simple and you don't have to worry about the gray areas of performance like you would with aging mechanical movements. Our last point here is the toughest one, and it's the fact that cheap watches are exactly that, cheap. You can get a great vintage quartz watch for only a few hundred, but I wouldn't recommend spending less than $500 on a vintage mechanical watch. That's because you'll ultimately pay more in repair costs than you did for the watch itself. So paying up a little bit more upfront, even if you have to save money, is worth it. Also, if you buy a cheap watch, it typically won't be that long before you want to buy another watch. With the more valuable stuff, that satisfaction tends to last a little bit longer. Just to recap, don't make the mistakes that I've made and don't be afraid to dig deep into the search results. That's where all the gems are. I'm Thomas Hendricks with Chrono24 in New York City, and now it's your turn. Let us know what watches we missed on this list, and if you have a personal story about a vintage watch that you've bought, we'd love to see it too.